Having surpassed 1,000 completed anime, it's time to review my old favorites and find out what holds up. I'm Sacrabolic, your envoy of hope, and this is Anime Favorite Search. A Silent Voice is a movie about a guy named Shoya who, when he was younger, he used to bully this deaf girl named Shoko. And he ended up getting really bullied because of that, because he took it so far that she had to transfer her out of their school. And so over time, he ended up growing very remorseful about the situation to the point where he actually became suicidal. And so he actually takes the effort to learn how to speak in sign language, specifically so that he can sort of close the book on that chapter of his life, apologize to Shoko, and then commit suicide. He doesn't end up committing suicide, and it's only sort of alluded to and brought up at the beginning of the film. But it is relevant for the parallels that are drawn between him and Shoko later on in the movie, but we'll get back to that. Anyway, he ends up becoming friends with Shoko, and so the movie is sort of about their friendship and also sort of about the themes of self-improvement. As I mentioned, Shoko hates herself as the main character did at the start of the film and presumably most of the middle of the film. And so at the end, towards the end of the film, she tries to kill herself and then Shoya ends up getting hurt in the process. I won't go too far into the details on the off chance someone has actually not seen this film, but the end of the movie does try to sort of create a parallel between Shoya's early redemption and Shoko's attempted redemption towards the end of the film. Now, will I say that having someone get hurt because they try to stop you from killing yourself deserves the same amount of redemption that bullying a deaf girl does? No, but the parallels are there and the movie clearly drew attention to it, so I felt the need to bring it up. Where I think A Silent Voice really focuses in on is, among many things, the sort of theme of self-improvement. And so after getting bullied, for example, Shoya is reluctant to look people in the eyes, and there's a scenes very early on where he looks around his classmates who are represented with X's over their face because he refuses to see the real them, basically. And he is inserting his own voice over them, talking about him being a creepy weirdo. Now, very unlikely that they are saying any of this or really paying him too much attention. This is probably his own psyche projecting onto the class. And of course, towards the end of the movie, he learns to accept people more and sort of come out of a shell and look them in the eyes. You also see this sort of level of progression with most of the other characters in the cast, although I wouldn't necessarily say all of them. Like Shoko's little sister ends up becoming more outgoing and ends up returning to school. Shoko's old childhood friend ends up learning to stop running away and face her problems. Shoko's mom ends up sort of making friends with Shoya's mom towards the end. And Shoya's mom doesn't change at all because she was an angel the entire time and is the only adult in the entire movie. But even the bully girl who ended up bullying Shoko basically just as much as Shoya did throughout the course of the series, despite saying that she will always hate Shoko towards the end, still mocks her, but does it in a haphazard sort of sign language that Shoko ends up correcting, showing that despite her insistence that she is not changing and will never like Shoko, she is still clearly making an effort at self-improvement. A Silent Voice was animated by Kyoto Animation, which is the greatest animation studio in Japan. And if you think it's MAPPA for some reason, do keep in mind that MAPPA CEO's apology for using his staff like slave labor, he specifically said that part of the reason he did it was so that he could attempt to compete with Kyoto Animation. So I don't think I need to get into the detail saying this movie is absolutely gorgeous, but I will say that as far as the visual language goes, I would have liked more extended visual metaphors. There's a lot of very good sort of landscape shots and establishing shots and stuff like that, and I think it uses montages in a semi-creative way, but I would like to see more visual metaphors throughout the course of it. Maybe they were there and I just didn't notice, but I would have liked to see more. And I would say that the movie itself needed probably about 30 extra minutes, which, considering it's 2 hours, you will almost never hear me say that. But I do feel that the romantic plot between Shoya and Shoko is a major focus, especially towards the middle part of the film. And it doesn't get a proper resolution. And I also feel like when Shoko makes her confession to Shoya on the bridge, I feel like going back over it, because this is the third time I've seen this film now, I feel like it sort of does come a little bit too early. I think there should have been more scenes establishing the relationship between Shoya and Shoko. The movie has almost too quick of a pace. But regardless, I would say that this is a movie that will give you the whole gambit of emotion. It'll make you feel sad. It'll certainly make you feel angry at all of the shitty characters, because boy knows no one in this movie, except for Shoya's mom, is perfect. It will make you feel trepidatious. It hits the whole gambit of human motion, and A Silent Voice is an excellent pathos delivery vehicle. Honestly, it's one of those movies that's like famous and popular to such an extreme extent that I'm sure you can find someone that will talk about it in greater depth than I am afforded the opportunity to in this limited format. And so instead of going too far into the minutia and every individual scenes of the film, I do want to focus in on one specific scene that has caught my attention every time I've watched this. And we're about to get really deep into this for no fucking reason. So you've basically heard the bulk of the review if you're not interested, but we need to talk about this bridge confession scene. All right, so it's not a secret that I watch most anime dubbed because, as I've said many times, if I read for too long, I get headaches because of my dumb lazy eye. So, every time I've seen this scene in the English dub before, this is the one instance where I'm like, I need to watch this in Japanese specifically so I know what the fuck is happening in the scene. Because we have Shoko telling Shoya that she loves him, and then he interprets that as a comment about the moon. Now, before we talk more about this, we need to talk about a man named Natsume Soseki. Now, Natsume Soseki was a Japanese novelist who basically wrote in the late 19th, early 20th century. And he believed that if you have a true connection with someone and you have a true understanding with them, you should be able to express your feelings for someone, not just through like specific spoken words, but through interpreting the intention of each other's statements. Which brings us to the phrase, Tsukigakure desu ne, which means the moon is beautiful, isn't it? Which is a phrase that means I love you, essentially, and was poetically brought into the greater Japanese culture to be basically a turn of phrase meaning I love you. There is no specific reply to this other than saying yes it is in some manner or another. Now, full disclosure, every time I have heard about the phrase Tsukigakure desu ne, I have heard it attributed to Natsume Soseki. But when looking up his name to make sure I knew what his fucking name was and that I wasn't talking completely out of my ass for this segment, I did find that it is debated whether he came up with this phrase, not necessarily in that there is an alternative, but just that it isn't 100% proven that he was the one specifically that came up to it. It's just commonly attributed to him. So take that with a little bit of a grain of salt, but the phrase itself has entered into Japanese vernacular, and that's really what we're focusing in on. So my assumption with this scene was always the reason that Shoya ended up interpreting her statement of I love you in English as the moon was a reference to the phrase Tsukigakure desu ne. But when watching this in Japanese, realized that she doesn't say the whole phrase. She actually says Suki, which is a way of saying I like you or I love you in Japanese. Now, to be totally honest, I don't recommend using that as your love confession word for the exact problem that comes up in this film, where this happens to be a moment where the moon is out in the middle of the day, as sometimes happens. And so Shoya hears this phrase, and probably because the moon is out, and probably because, honestly, differentiating between the word Suki and Suki is pretty fucking hard, even when the person saying it isn't deaf. And also because of his own internal self-loathing, he interprets this as a comment about the currently out moon, thus completely misinterpreting what she was trying to say. And so his reply, of course, is Suki kere dane, which is actually a way of saying the moon is beautiful, isn't it? But sort of in a more informal, aggressive manner. And what I find interesting about this specific reply is to her love confession, he does, albeit accidentally, reply with his own love confession. And interestingly enough, when she hears this, partially because of his tone of inflection, but also probably because of her own insecurities and her own self-loathing, She instead runs away from it and interprets it as him not reciprocating her feelings and him not understanding her, which he didn't. She is correct in that. But we can sort of get the feeling and the implication that Shoya actually does have feelings for Shoko. And so what I find interesting is this is, albeit accidentally, a scene where the two characters do end up confessing their loves to each other, but through the lens of the phrase Sukegakure desune, or in this case, Sukekure dane, we see that the confession of the moon is beautiful, isn't it, is not given a proper reply, specifically because it is a phrase designed to reflect the idea of the people having such a great understanding from each other that they don't need words to convey their emotions. And this scene goes to show that despite both characters likely having feelings for each other, they do not have a great enough understanding of each other, and also probably in extension, a great enough self-respect for themselves to properly understand each other's feelings and properly accept this love confession on either side. And I will say that having specifically watched this in Japanese, and this being my third viewing of this movie, this one scene has probably become, at this point, my favorite scene in the entire movie. Twitch and Discord in the description. I've been Sacrobolic, your envoy of hope. Bye-bye.